This is a short video for beginners in photography, and I'm going to show you a really quick and easy way to set up your camera. The first place to start is by looking at the mode dial on the top, and you'll see there are P, S, A and M. P stands for program, and this is an automatic setting which still allows you to use ISO and white balance. Next is shutter priority, and this is sometimes labelled as TV on Canon. And what this does is allow you to control the shutter speed so you can get blurry water effects or to freeze something. Then there's aperture priority or AV mode on the Canon. This is where you can create those blurry backgrounds behind people's heads and you can get everything in focus, and that's where you can control your depth of field. And finally M, which is manual, which we won't be touching. The next place to start is with ISO, actually pronounced ISO, but most people say ISO, so we'll go with that. This is where you make the camera more or less sensitive to light. So in bright conditions, you can get away with 100 to 400 ISO, but in low light levels, 1600, 3200, 64, you can go quite high with it. If you look at these two images, you can see the difference that high ISO makes compared to low ISO. It tends to get more granular, you see more speckles, but I'm quite zoomed in. So if we look back out at a full size, you can see it looks okay. In fact, most modern cameras have really clean ISO, so you're probably best just leaving it set to auto and then just adjust your exposure compensation. If you're photographing in JPEG mode, then next place to look is white balance, labelled as WB on the camera. This is quite crucial because otherwise your camera may photograph something and make it quite orange or quite blue, and it's quite difficult to take out in post, so it's worth getting it right. It's actually really easy. If you look, you've got a sun icon, which is for sunny, you've got a cloud icon for cloudy, tungsten or incandescent for indoor, the orangey looking lights. If you photograph under fluorescence, there's a fluorescent tube setting, and there's a custom and all sorts. So it's quite straightforward. White balance settings can also be used quite creatively. If you're photographing a sunset, for example, you might want to put it into cloud or shade. This will make it much more orange and give you a more intense sky. Later on in evening and dusk and nighttime, if you want the blues to be really strong, put it into incandescent, the bulb setting, and it really gives you those lovely blue skies and it makes all the street lights look white. For those photographing in RAW, it doesn't matter because you're going to set this in post afterwards anyway. Okay, there are a few things to consider, such as autofocus. Most of the time you'll have it on automatic setting. I tend to leave it on AFS. This is a single point of focus, so for portraits and landscapes, once you press the button down, this locks. If you're going to photograph anything moving, look at AFC. This is continuous, so something coming towards you, your camera will then automatically refocus for you, which is a lot quicker and easier, and you'll never be able to do it yourself anyway. And finally, manual. Manual's great for when the subject isn't moving, you're on a tripod, and you know it's going to hit the spot that you need. If you're new to photography, it's fine to leave it on program, the P setting on the mode dial. This is automatic. You can also set auto ISO, you can set auto white balance, and just concentrate on experimenting and practicing your skills. One thing you'll find is the exposure will be right most of the time. So to control this, we've got an exposure compensation button, which is a plus and a minus. It'll be on the top or the back of your camera and looks like this. One of the things to do is leave it set on 0 and take a test shot. If the image looks too dark, plus it, maybe +1, +2. If it looks too bright, then minus it, maybe -1 or -2. But make sure you always leave it on 0 when you've finished because you don't know what the next shot's going to be. The next setting is shutter priority. As I said, this is quite good for controlling the speeds of things in your image. Now you may want to blur something such as water or maybe a car or bike going past. And actually you can go down to sort of a 15th of a second handheld with a wide angle, and if you just sort of track across, then you can get quite nice blurry effects in the background. The other thing it's useful for is to freeze action, and you'll find that you'll need quite fast shutter speeds sometimes. If it's somebody walking or running towards you, somewhere between 125th and 200th of a second will get them looking okay. And for really fast things like birds and maybe cars or motorbikes, you'll need something up around 250, 500. If you go too fast, it can actually freeze the action. So just be aware that you want to add some kind of energy and a little bit of movement back into the picture. The next one is aperture priority. Now, as I said, this is really, really good for giving you those sort of fuzzy backgrounds. So when you're photographing people, they will be sharp and the background will be out of focus. This also gives faster shutter speeds, which means you get less camera shake so that you get a better ratio of pictures that you can keep. So these lower aperture numbers such as 2, 2.8, f4 will give you what's called a shallow depth of field. That's the area that's in focus. If you want a large area in focus, a large depth of field, which you typically use in landscape photography, then numbers such as f11, f16 or f22 will do that for you. And I've come up with a useful saying, which is small f number, small depth of field. A large f number, a large depth of field. And if you can remember that, you should be okay when you're using aperture priority. Finally, think about your composition. What's the most important thing in frame? Where are you going to place your subject? The idea really is to draw the viewer in so that when they look at your photograph, they know what they're supposed to be looking at, and you sort of take them into the point that's most important for you. You can use something called the rule of thirds. This is a 3x3 grid, and it looks a bit like a noughts and crosses board. And what this does is allow you to kind of frame important areas of your scene so that you might put the important part a third of the way in on one of these lines, and it might be from the left or from the top, from the right, it doesn't matter. And it's the same with landscapes. Ideally, you don't really want the horizon to be bang in the middle. It tends to look better if it's on the third line coming up or the third line from the top. And if the ground is more interesting, then put more of that in. If you feel everything looks better centered, then do so.